So the structure will be, we have 4 poets, between 15 and 20 minutes each, total sharing. We're going to break that into 2 sets. So each of the poets will read their first set, then we'll have about a 10-minute break. Have the opportunity for chugling, schmoozing, whatever you want to do. There's food and there's drink in there. We have a contribution receptor of some sort over there. Suitcase, right. So if you're feeling so inclined to break, please think of us that way. I'll have some other announcements at the halfway mark. I'll just leave you with this and we'll get started with Ms. Sarton. And that's, you know, when you, the artist and the art are not the same thing, but the artist long gone is realized in the art. So if we hear a Mozart concerto, there is something of Mr. Mozart in that concerto that is somehow conveyed to us through his art. And it's all we have is his art. If you look at a painting by, you know, let's say The Last Supper by Mr. Da Vinci, great work of art. The difference between looking at a work of art in a book and then going to a museum and standing in front of it is you feel the energy of it because you have the realization of the actual thing. Same thing with the music. I can hear it recorded. If I go to a live concert and hear it, I actually feel it. And it's the same thing with poetry. Poetry is kind of a legacy that's been left to us in 2 dimensions on a page somewhere until it's realized through the spirit and the body of someone speaking it as if they were the instrument or the vehicle of the poem. And that's what I love about dead poets, because we have people who are long gone, who are accessible to us only usually through our own reading or perhaps an obscure recording of some sort. Well, Mr. Thomas is certainly not obscure recordings of the 4 here. He probably is the one who is most celebrated as a speaker of his poems. But what we have tonight then are people who are going to bring the poetry back to life through the embodiment of their own spirit and their own elocution. And I'm very grateful to them for that. It's a special privilege to be in their company. So we're going to start with Ms. Sarton. She's going to read for a little while, and then we're going to move on to Mr. Thomas, Mr. Bukowski, and Ms. Swift. So round of applause for Ms. Sarton.
And first I'd like to thank the Silveroton Poetry Association for inviting me here as a poet, because in my lifetime I was not celebrated as a poet, and that has been a source of lifelong and death-long regret to me. I wrote 15 volumes of poetry during my long life, almost 20 novels, and 13 journals or collections of essays. And unfortunately, although the journals and the novels made my fame and fortune, my poetry was sorely neglected by the people who really counted. And I see even some remnants of that today when Mr. Thomas here was mentioned as though he were preeminent over me. But I am glad to see him here because he was a much needed lyric voice in mid-century, in that age of Pound and Eliot, those obscure, esoteric poets. So I would like to begin with a poem which I think represents the many paradoxes of my long career. I lived from 1912 to 1995, and I published my poetry from 1937, my first volume, to 1994. My life was filled with passion, rage, outrage, and oftentimes outrageous behavior. My poetry, my journals, and my fiction were known for tranquility, grace, peace, reason. And I think you will see those extremes exemplified in this poem, published in 1971, called Dutch Interior. Peter the Hooch, 1629-1682. I recognize the quiet and the charm, this safe enclosed room where a woman sews and life is tempered, orderly, and calm. Through the Dutch door, half open, sunlight streams and throws a pale square down on the red tiles. The cozy black dog suns himself and dreams. Even the bed is sheltered. It encloses a cupboard to keep people safe from harm, where copper glows with the warm flush of roses. The atmosphere is all domestic, human, chaos subdued by the sheer power of need. This is a room where I have lived as woman. Lived too what the Dutch painter does not tell. The wild skies overhead, dissolving, breaking, and how that broken light is never still, and how the roar of waves is always near. What bitter tumult, treacherous and cold, attacks the solemn charm year after year. It must be felt as peace won and maintained against those terrible antagonists. How many from this quiet room have drowned? How many left to go, drunk on the wind, and take their ships into heartbreaking seas? How many whom no woman's peace could bind? Bent to her sewing, she looks drenched in calm. Raw grief is disciplined to the fine thread. But in her heart, this woman is the storm, alive deep in herself, holds wind and rain, remaking chaos into an intimate order, where sometimes light flows through a window pane. I was born in Belgium, but my parents immigrated to this country 3 years later, and my father became an eminent philosopher and historian of science at Harvard University. I attended school in Harvard, in Cambridge rather, but I never did go to college because I immediately left Cambridge for New York following Eva Le Gallienne and spent my 20s becoming an actress. And I also was chosen by Miss Gallienne to be the director of her apprentice theater, which unfortunately folded during the Depression. During that time, I did write poetry, however, and after the theater folded, I decided I would commit myself for the rest of my life to poetry. I spent quite a bit of time abroad. I had numerous affairs with both men and women. Those of you familiar with my work know that I could never compose poetry without having a muse, a person, usually a woman, whom I was in love with. It didn't matter whether the relationship was consummated. All I needed was that erotic desire. But another paradox. There's almost no explicit sexuality in my poetry, or my novels for that matter. I really eschewed that and disliked it in the work of others. I'm going to read you an early sonnet, probably written when I was only about 20 years old. It appeared in my first volume of poetry, published in 1937. And by the way, my dear friend Louise Bogan chastised me for writing sonnets. She thought that women in the 20th century should not write sonnets, especially whole sequences of sonnets. Well, whenever I had a muse, a woman that I was erotically attracted to, I wrote a sequence of sonnets as a matter of course. So this is a recording of my first serious relationship. We who had been so wounded and so cloven were grafted like two trees into one bark, and our two colors sharply interwoven, the delicate and bright, the tawny dark. Out of our mingled blood, petal and flower, with a sharp, fertile perfume of its own, love came upon us softly in that hour. We did not see that love lay there alone. And when we woke out of the dream she made, nothing had changed. The earth was just the same. And we, so wounded, strangers and afraid, standing apart, saying each other's name, looked down and saw love luminous and wild, lying between us like a sleeping child. Now, I was a feminist from the very beginning. In my first volume of poems, published in 1937, I had what you would consider to be a feminist poem. This was long before the revival of feminism in the 1960s in this country. It's a long poem, so I will just read the first section. It is entitled, "She Shall Be Called Woman," and it's taken from Genesis chapter 2, verse 23. She did not cry nor move. She lay quite still and leaned against the great curve of the earth, and her breast was like a fruit bursten of its own sweetness. She did not move nor cry out. She only looked down at the hand against her breast. She looked down at the naked hand and wept. She could not yet endure this delicate savage to lie upon her. She could not yet endure the blood to beat so there. She could not cope with the first ache of fullness. She lay quite still and looked down at the hand where blood was locked and longed to loose the blood and let it flow over her breast like rain. And one more from my 1948 volume. I'm just going to read an excerpt from it because it's rather ambitious. This is called "My Sisters, Oh My Sisters." Dickinson, Rossetti, Sappho, they all know it. Something is lost, strained, unforgiven in the poet. She abdicates from life, or like George Sand, suffers from the mortality in an immortal hand. Only when she built inward in a fearful isolation did anyone succeed or learn to fuse emotion with thought. Only when she renounced did Emily begin in the fierce, lonely fight to learn to be. Only in the extremity of spirit and flesh, and in renouncing passion, did Sappho come to bless. Only in the farewells or in old age does sanity shine through the crimson stains of their mortality. And now we who are writing women and strange monsters still search our hearts to find the difficult answers, still hope that we may learn to lay our hands more gently and more subtly on the burning sands. To be through what we make more simply human, to come to the deep place where poet becomes woman, where nothing has to be renounced or given over in the pure light that shines out from the lover, in the pure light that brings forth fruit and flower, and that great sanity, that sun, the feminine power.
1914, on October 27th, in the Welsh city of Swansea. And ever since in Swansea I had an affinity for the sea, a great affinity for the curlews, the sea, writing poetry, and nothing else, very, very little else. And beginning on the theme of lively promiscuity, I give you this poem titled Lament. When I was a windy boy and a bit, and the black spit of the chapel fold sighed the old ramrod dying of women, I tiptoed shy in the gooseberry wood, the rude owl cried like a telltale chit. I skipped in a blush as the big girls rolled 9 pin down on the donkey's common. And on seesaw Sunday nights I wooed whoever I would with my wicked eyes. The whole of the moon I could love and leave all the green-leaved little weddings' wives in the cold black bush and let them grieve. When I was a gusty man and a half, and the black beast of the Beatles' pews, sighed the old ramrod dying of bitches, not a boy and a bit in the wick-dipping moon, or drunk as a new-dropped calf. I whistled all night in the twisted flues, midwives grew in the midnight ditches, and the sizzling beds of the towns cried quick. Whenever I dove in a breast-high shoal, wherever I ramped in the clover quilts, whatsoever I did in the cold black night, I left my quivering prints. When I was a man you could call a man, and the black cross of the holy house, sighed the old ramrod, dying of welcome. Brandy and ripe in my bright base prime, no spring-tailed Tom in the red-hot town, with every simmering woman his mouse, but a hillocky bull in the swelter of summer, come in his great good time, to the sultry, biding herds, I said. Oh, time enough when the blood creeps cold, and I lie down but to sleep in bed, for my sulking, skulking, cold black soul. When I was a half of the man I was, and served me right as the preachers warn, sighed the old ramrod, dying of downfall. No flailing calf, nor cat in a flame, or hickory bowl in milky grass, but a black sheep with a crumpled horn. At last the soul from its foul mouse hole slunk pouting out when the limp time came, and I gave my soul a blind slashed eye, gristle and rind and aurora's life, and I shoved it into the cold black sky to find a woman's soul for a wife. Now I am a man, no more, no more, and a black reward for a roaring life, sighed the old ramrod, dying of strangers. Tidy and cursed in my dove-cooed room, I lie down thin and hear the good bells jaw. For oh, my soul found a Sunday wife in the coal black sky, and she bore angels. Harpies around me out of her womb, chastity prays for me, piety sings, innocence sweetens my last black breath. Modesty hides my thighs in her wings, and all the deadly virtues plague my death. I never mind a bit of theatre. There was a Saviour rarer than radium, commoner than water, crueler than truth. Children kept from the sun, assembled at his tongue to hear the golden note turn in a groove. Prisoners of wishes locked their eyes in the jails and studies of his keyless smiles. The voice of children says from a lost wilderness, there was calm to be done in his safe unrest, when, hindering man hurt, man, animal, or bird, we hid our fears in that murdering breath. Silence, silence to do when the earth grew loud, in lairs and asylums of the tremendous shout. There was glory to hear in the churches of his tears. Under his downy arm you sighed as he struck. O you who could not cry onto the ground when a man died, put a tear for joy in the unearthly flood, and laid your cheek against a cloud-formed shell. Now in the dark there is only yourself and myself. Two proud bracked brothers cry, winter locked side by side to this inhospitable hollow year. Oh, we who could not stir one lean sigh when we heard greed on man beating near and fire neighbor, but wailed and nested in the sky blue wall. Now break a giant tear for the little known fall. For the drooping of homes that did not nurse our bones, brave deaths of only ones but never found. Now see alone in us, our own true strangers' dust, ride through the doors of our unentered house. Exiled in us, we arouse the soft, unclenched, armless silk and rough love that breaks all rocks.